In today's episode, I'm going to be breaking down the most important lore, characters, and plot points from my original series on this channel, Multiverse Tales, which contains within it the majority of the other episodes I make on this channel. For instance, my dragon episodes all take place in Tayrun Jaanavar's universe, one of my original characters who narrates my dragon and fantasy monster episodes. Whereas my mech armor episodes take place in Benny Sharp's universe, and Benny Sharp tends to be the narrator of those as he's the character that designs the different mech armors. This is also a community redraw episode. A month ago, I wrote out 4 character descriptions for 4 of the characters from Multiverse Tales that I haven't taken the time to design myself yet, and asked my subscribers to pick one of the descriptions and draw what they think the character should look like. I'll show off all the submissions that came in for each character, but I'll be redrawing my favorite of each one, and those will then be the canonical designs for those characters. This is also kind of a Multiverse Tales story in its own right, which you'll see what I mean when I get into the setup, but for the most part, it's just an explainer to get you all caught up on the lore and get the characters themselves caught up with each other. You'll see what I mean. Let's just get into it, shall we? Let's go. Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. The team of multiverse traversing heroes, who go by the somewhat ironic name, the Sharp Gang, had realized that they were all well overdue for a group meeting to discuss what they all collectively knew about the multiverse, each other, and the foes that they regularly contended with. As a result, the 15 core members gathered for their first monthly meeting and laid out even the information that seemed basic to most of them, just to ensure they were all on the same page. They were even able to acquire some new information and clarification from an unusually cooperative prisoner the group was holding, who went by the name Herald the Herald, the right hand of one of the group's main antagonists, who they'd discuss in more detail later on. They started by going over information about the multiverse itself and what they knew of its workings. The multiverse they found themselves in was not made up of branching timelines and an infinite number of universes. Instead, it consisted of roughly 26,000 universes, though since the dawn of the multiverse, some universes had been destroyed and some new ones had been made. They were generally referred to by an alphabetical and numerical sequence. For instance, the universe they were all currently meeting in was A016. Most universes contain multiple life-bearing planets, and the number can vary dramatically between universes, but some will only have one core planet with life. Each universe is meant to be watched and guarded by an overseer. This is a being granted certain abilities to ensure they can help their world flourish. Though, as the group had seen on many occasions, overseers do not always have the best intentions for the worlds they watch. The role of overseer can be passed to any sentient being, even a particularly intelligent Gopher, oddly enough, and rarely will an overseer choose to keep their role for more than a few hundred years. The only ways for an overseer to lose their role is to choose to pass it on to someone else, to have it stolen by someone possessing part of an ancient artifact called the Multiversal Orb, or for the overseer to be killed. If they are killed while containing an overseer energy, that energy disappears, and the universe they oversaw can never again have an overseer, though many of these universes will go on just fine without one. Different overseers may have different powers, but there is a general core set of abilities granted to an overseer when the overseer energy for a certain universe is placed into their body. All of these powers are controlled using a set of glowing runes that often appear on an overseer's forearms, though they can appear on different parts of the body for some overseers. The first ability that the overseer will have is a halted lifespan, so they can maintain their role as long as they wish, though they can choose to age themselves up or down as they please if they are a skilled enough overseer. Another ability is that they have a deep-rooted connection to their universe and the worlds within it, and can control the weather to a certain degree on these planets. They can sway and sometimes even control the less intelligent creatures of their world, and slightly manipulate the moods of the people in their world, though the more consciously aware someone is, the less affected they will be by this. It should be noted that the previous 2 abilities are only things they can do while in their own universe. An overseer cannot manipulate the weather or other people of other universes. They also have the ability to open portals to other dimensions, though overseers can choose to lock their dimension off so nobody can get in or out without their permission. Unless, of course, they have access to a rare item that allows them to override this, such as the previously mentioned Multiversal Orb, which the group would discuss more later. Most notably, however, overseers have the ability to store and manipulate energy. Everything and every being in the multiverse is made up of energy, and overseers have the power to see the energy makeup of all things, to copy different energies, and reconstruct them to make new plants, creatures, or even living beings. Making a living being is a very time-consuming process, however, and depending on the complexity and the skill of the overseer involved, it can take anywhere from a day of constant non-stop work to a month to complete. On top of that, unless the overseer imbues these beings with a soul energy, the one type of energy that cannot be copied, the being created is essentially like a non-computer version of an artificial intelligent robot. They may be able to learn and form new patterns, but they cannot make true morally determined decisions. Talking about this prompted Herald the Herald to clarify to the group that a soul energy, which every truly sentient being possesses within their body, is not a soul itself, but is a vessel which allows a soul to enter that body. How a soul chooses what body to enter and why could only be speculated about, though various religions, prophets, and spiritualists across the multiverse had their own theories. Another wrench that Herald threw into the mix was the fact that a body possessing a soul energy did not necessarily guarantee that being had a soul, just that they had the potential to have one, though he admitted that even this was delving into unprovable territory. While Herald was speaking, they asked him to clarify another piece of information some of them had been discussing as of late: the reason that many universes seem to have alternate versions of very similar beings and creatures. For instance, they'd all put together that in Benny Sharp's universe, he'd made sets of mech armors that were very similar to dragons that appeared in Tayrun's universe, as well as in a popular horror video game series from Dr. Champagne McGregor's universe. This is likely because of the Akashic records. The Akashic records are essentially the multiverse's collective subconscious. They contain a record of every creature, being, thing, and event to ever occur in the multiverse. Every sentient being is linked to these records, though most have no clue that they are. This means they may create something, thinking it to be an original creation, while in actuality they are drawing inspiration from something in the Akashic records, meaning they will make something similar in some degree to a being, creature, or thing that exists or has existed somewhere else in the multiverse. While some have suspected that these records do not physically exist, Herald claimed to have visited them once himself, but that the keeper of the records would not permit him to return. Ever. He did speculate that with a piece of the Multiversal Orb he could force his way back in, but the group was certainly not going to let him give this a try. And with him bringing up the orb, they then discussed it next. The Multiversal Orb is an ancient artifact of incredible power. It contains within it nearly every type of energy in the multiverse and is able to overrule many sets of rules in the multiverse, such as allowing someone to steal an overseer's ability or let someone teleport into an otherwise locked-off universe. With the full orb, an overseer is also able to make living beings of any form near instantly. One of the Sharp Gang's members, Astra, once possessed the full orb herself, given to her by her cruel and hateful mother, Tarsa, and Astra split the orb into 4 pieces and eventually parted ways with some of those pieces. Even as 4 separate shards, however, each piece is still incredibly powerful in its own right. Currently, an enemy of the group, Dresden Oakland, possesses 2 of the pieces of the orb, while the Sharp Gang possesses the other 2. Additionally, while this didn't need saying in the moment, as mentioned briefly before, the group was conducting this meeting out of their collective base of operations in Dimension A016. The building itself was once the Agency of Supernatural Protection, which would get elaborated on further when Sterling, Alexis, and Astra explained their backgrounds. The agency had become unnecessary some years ago, and since then, the building had been abandoned and repurposed into what they all now jokingly called the Sharp Tank. There were rooms for every member of the group within it, though many did not live there full time. The group rattled off a few more other tidbits of information, such as the fact that there was a place called the Everyverse, where overseers could go to test out their creations and experiment with new creatures. But beyond that, it seemed as though they had caught each other up on all the core information, so they decided to move on to some proper introductions, and ensure that everyone in the group knew one another a little bit better. First to introduce herself was Bio-Mech Kayla, which was the name used by Michaela Maciel and her sentient biomechanical enhancement/friend, Charlie. Kayla's home universe was B167, and she was once a sci-fi movie-obsessed workaholic who lived a fairly normal life, unaware of the multiverse's existence, until she met Charlie. Charlie is a Bio-Mech. His kind have the ability to latch on to living beings and alter parts of their bodies into mechanical weaponry or tools. They can attach themselves to non-living things as well, but they are significantly less powerful when they do this. Charlie is also only able to alter parts of Kayla's body at a time. They can also absorb different types of technology to enhance themselves further. Charlie and other Bio-Mechs had been residing for as long as Charlie could remember on a moon in dimension C284 that some people in that universe used as a dump. Charlie had absorbed a broken multiversal warp drive that had been left on the moon, which malfunctioned upon him absorbing it and sent chunks of that moon, and the Bio-Mechs along with it, scattering across different dimensions of the multiverse. Hence how Charlie and others of Charlie's species had ended up in Kayla's universe. Additionally, when a Bio-Mech attaches to an Overseer, the Overseer will often completely fall unconscious, or in the very least be totally unable to use any of their abilities. Astra's theory for why this occurred would be discussed later on when they got to the creator of the Bio-Mechs, Dresden, Oakland. After Kayla and Charlie, Tayrun Jaanavar introduced himself. He was a Beast Chronicler, though now also a Beast Summoner, from Dimension T905. His father had been absent from his life since birth, and his mother and sister were both killed by the overseer of his world, Elloise, when Tayrun was still young, though he had thought their deaths to be an accident until after he'd met Kayla only a few years ago. His world was not technologically evolved and largely resembled the medieval fantasy fiction found in pop culture in worlds like Kayla's. Tayrun had known nothing about other universes until Kayla had come to his world with Charlie, looking for a rogue Bio-Mech, and helped open Tayrun's eyes to more possibilities, both outside his world and within it. In an event that would happen later on, where Tayrun had met many of the people now at this meeting, Tayrun and the others had defeated the Overseer of his world, Elloise, and used shards of the Multiversal Orb to take his Overseer energy and give it to Tayrun. Tayrun is now the overseer of his universe and is doing his best to ensure it is thriving. With Astra's help, he has also gained and tried out new abilities, but the one that he has decided to stick with is the power to summon and largely control different beasts from his world, though he can only do this with creatures he has met and tamed to some degree. Also, whatever injuries the creature he is summoning incurs while fighting for him will also be translated onto Tayrun, so he must be very careful about what he commands them to do. If they are killed in battle while under his control, he will die as well. Benny Sharp suddenly leapt up as Tayrun was finishing to point out that Tayrun and Kayla were a couple. The group hadn't intended to talk about romantic relationships, but agreed to upon Benny's weird insistence, though some of them speculated that he was just doing so because he wanted to brag about his relationship with Dr. Champagne McGreggor when it got to his turn. Next up was Heath Hurricane Reynolds. He is from Dimension K998, which was ravaged by an onslaught of kaiju attacks a few years back. While he didn't know this at the time, this was largely Astra's fault, as she had left a malfunctioning piece of the Multiversal Orb in Heath's dimension as she was traveling the multiverse. It had started creating gigantic monsters all across Heath's world. Luckily, when he found the orb shard, its glitching also affected him and gave him incredible powers with which he could fight back against the kaiju. He can use a certain amount of high-level strength and invulnerability per day, but if he overdoes it too much, he will have to sleep and recover, sometimes even passing out while in the field. Using his abilities can also summon quick spurts of strange weather, lightning strikes, hurricane-like winds, or even quick bursts of hail. Now, Heath tests his might and improves his skills with his powers ever more by fighting both with this team and with kaiju slayers in his own world to take on bigger and bigger threats, pushing his limits. As requested by Benny, Heath also pointed out that he and Vasilia Kuznet were in a relationship, which made sense to everyone present, as they were both tall, confident, and gorgeous. Astra, Sterling, and Alexis went next, as their backgrounds were all directly and somewhat complicatedly linked. Astra tried to pretend that she wasn't still embarrassed about all the problems she'd caused various members of this group in the past, though they had all forgiven her at this point. Astra was the overseer of the universe they were conducting this meeting in, A016, where Sterling and Alexis were both from as well. Astra had been the daughter of the previous overseer of this world, Tarsa, who herself had been the overseer of other dimensions prior to her time in A016. Astra had been raised simply to follow her mother's orders and take over as the overseer of A016 so Tarsa could retire in peace. But Astra despised her mother and had other plans. Tarsa eventually gave Astra the overseer energy of A016 as well as the Multiversal Orb, but instead of running that world the way Tarsa had instructed, Astra instead gave a shard of the orb to a friend-turned-enemy of Tarsa's named Lucifer, who she'd been keeping captive in a pocket dimension for centuries. While the shard Astra gave him was not enough to let Lucifer leave the very well-constructed pocket dimension, he was able to make and send demons out into A016, and Astra watched Tarsa squirm as her world was overrun with demons, making her retirement far less pleasant. This was where Sterling and Alexis came in. They were two of the few people who had superhuman abilities in their world, and they helped create the Agency of Supernatural Protection to try and discover where the demons were coming from and to help protect people from them. Astra became intrigued with the lives of Sterling and Alexis and eventually decided to implant herself in their lives. She altered her form to look like Lucifer's daughter, and used pieces of the Multiversal Orb to implant memories into his mind of her being his actual daughter, going by the name Diamos. She then became friends with Sterling and Alexis as Diamos, and helped them fight off her so-called father. She even got into a romantic relationship with Sterling, and eventually realized that what she was doing was pretty messed up. She then constructed a scenario where she could help them defeat Lucifer and get rid of all his demons and fake her own death in the process, so she'd never have to reveal her treachery to them. She then locked off her universe and left it for a few years, spending her time traveling the multiverse as her actual self, Astra, making some friends, but more enemies, until her past caught up with her. In the same ordeal where Tayrun became the overseer of his universe, Sterling and Alexis found Astra and discovered the truth about her past deception. They eventually forgave her, it taking Alexis longer to get to that point than Sterling, and she is now part of their group and doing all she can to atone for her past, as she tries to be a genuinely good overseer for her world and help solve problems in other universes as well. All while still being a little bit of a hooligan, to be honest. With that tale all given, Astra also elaborated on her abilities, beyond the obvious overseer ones she possessed. She could turn into a dragon at will that could shoot steam and sonic blasts from its mouth, and Astra had the unique ability among overseers to manipulate the energy within her own body. This is seen by most as being akin to a person doing intestinal surgery on themselves, and few overseers would ever be willing to attempt it. This means she can alter the powers that she possesses, but she generally likes the dragon ability that she currently has. Alexis and Sterling then gave further information about themselves. Alexis's powers were generally referred to as mineral magnetism. She could attract and repel rocks and minerals to and from her body at rapid speeds. She often used this to make large stony fists for herself with which to fight. She also had some base-level super strength and durability, assisting her in lifting the heavy rocks she fought with. Alexis and Sterling were generally regarded as the leaders of the Sharp Gang, though Alexis was more of the confident field leader, calling the shots on most missions, while Sterling was more like the HR department, making sure everyone was happy and healthy and working well as a group. Sterling's powers were slightly more unusual. He had both the ability to shoot flames from his hands, and sometimes other parts of his body, at fast enough speeds to allow him to fly. Plus, he had the ability to emit a liquid silver metal from his body to turn his hands into weapons, or to protect himself from harm. His use of both abilities can be significantly hindered if he gets too cold, as he has to keep his body temperature up for both his powers to work properly. He also has a sort of super mode that he calls Silver Nova, where his entire body is engulfed in flames and metal, massively elevating his strength, speed, and power manipulation, but he can only hold that mode for so long, and is incredibly drained of energy after using it. Next up to introduce himself would be the impatiently waiting man, after which their team and building were named. But after standing up as if to start speaking, Benny waited exactly 10 seconds before he began, and nobody was really sure why. Good old Benny Sharp was a mech armor maker from dimension M289, which is full of thousands of superheroes and villains. Like Astra, Benny had a bit of a colorful past, which he was not remotely shy about sharing. He used to make mech armors for anyone who would pay him enough, including making a mech armor for a hero, then turning around and making one for the villain they were going up against. Benny had met the group after Kayla and Charlie had come to his universe and gotten into trouble with an organization that Benny had never trusted in the past, the Superhero Corrections and Placement Foundation, an organization which had various versions of itself in other dimensions. Benny did claim to now have a tentative agreement with the Superhero Corrections and Placement Foundation through one of their members, Abigail Apicquash, so that he and others from their group could travel freely in and out of his universe. Benny had also made multiverse jumping wristwatches for everyone in the Sharp Gang, so that even non-Overseer members could travel the multiverse as they wanted, though these couldn't get them in or out of locked-off universes without a Multiversal Orb shard. Benny had been the one to come up with the name The Sharp Gang early on, as well as the base of operations name, The Sharp Tank, and while Benny wasn't even one of the most consistent members to go out on missions, most in the group had found the names somewhat funny and agreed to go with those until they came up with something better. The group had also learned recently, through Harold the Herald, that Benny likely had a stronger connection than most to the Akashic records, as the mech armors he made often heavily resembled creatures and beings from other universes, and specifically from pop culture shows, movies, and video games in his boyfriend's universe. Benny then also proudly boasted that he was in a committed relationship with Dr. Champagne McGreggor, who he pulled up out of his seat next to him, and who seemed very uncomfortable with Benny's boisterous proclamation, though admitted it was correct. Grudgingly, the Doctor introduced himself next, and was likely the group member most people knew the least well. He was from dimension M723, which had its fair share of superheroes and villains as well, though not nearly as many as Benny's. Dr. Champagne was a former dinosaur geneticist who had worked for a notoriously ill-run dinosaur theme park called Dino Cross Park. He despised his job and the higher-ups he'd worked for, and was constantly made to create, incubate, and raise dinosaurs to look like characters from pop culture video games, movies, and shows in his world. He had since left this job to do something that interested him much more. He was working with a team of superheroes in his world called the Psi-5, whom he'd always been quite a fan of, and who some of the members of the Sharp Gang had met before. Champagne was helping the Psi-5 develop and train their powers by studying their genes and telling them what they may be able to achieve. He'd first worked alongside some members of the Psi-5 after learning that Dino Cross Park, where he worked, was run by one of the Psi-5's core villains, Eunice Versailles, or Dr. Universe. Everyone in the Sharp Gang who had interacted with Dr. Champagne had quickly noticed that he was a fairly grouchy man, but like most members of the group, it was also clear that he was actively working on bettering himself, and his time with everyone in the group was helping him to do this, though his closest relationships were with Benny Sharp and Vasilia Kuznet. Vasilia stood next. She was from the same universe as Tayrun, T905, and was an armor crafter, often making suits of armor from the hides of dragons and creatures brought to her by Tayrun. The Kuznets had a long history of making armors in her world, and despite the fact that magic had faded for quite some time while the previous overseer, Eulidas, was in charge, Vasilia had always been able to use magic to imbue her armors with different powers and abilities. Plus, since Tayrun had taken over as the overseer of their world, it seemed that there was a significant resurgence in the ability for people to use magic, and Vasilia was having a much easier time with it. Some of her family members had also met members of the Sharp Gang. Her brother, Voslo Kuznet, lived with her and was a massive asset to their village, spending many of his days helping anyone in need with whatever chores or issues they had. Vasilia's younger cousin, Naseko, had also recently met some of the members of the group, and Naseko had actually hit it off with one of the group's youngest members, Jake, though he did find her obsession with insects and her blunt, overly honest attitude a bit unnerving. Vasilia also once had a secret that she kept from the group, that being that she can turn into a were-jaguar at will. But since this secret was outed to the group, she now uses the ability more confidently when need be. Vasilia also had a squirrel ally named Zashitnik, who worked as a scout for her and was unusually intelligent for being, just a squirrel. Speaking of intelligent rodents, however, Gooby the Gopher stood up in his chair next, but just looked over to Sterling and gestured towards him. Sterling was about to do the introduction for the Gopher when Benny chimed in, saying, "I'm telling yous, his name ain't Gooby, it's Archibald, and the little rat can talk for himself and he knows it." Nobody but Benny had ever heard the Gopher speak, and while some did actually believe Benny, they also thought it was funnier to pretend they didn't. Sterling then introduced him as Gooby, a name Sterling himself had given the Gopher when he met him in BackCells prison. The group didn't know much about how Gooby had become so intelligent, but so far as they knew, he'd once been a regular Gopher that Benny Sharp had tried to drown, allegedly trying to prove that Gophers could breathe underwater, though as always Benny refused to clarify the circumstances around this event, and just said, "Who can remember why I did or did not try to drown the little guy? Let's just move on, it's in the past, For some reason, they all just accepted this, and Sterling pressed on to say that the Gopher had then had a vendetta against Benny and had stolen a ray gun from Sharp, with which he then tried to kill Benny on multiple occasions. The Gopher even somehow then managed to become the overseer of a now seriously malfunctioning universe and used the abilities it acquired to try and kill both Benny and Dr. Champagne. After besting the Gopher, they'd then gotten Astra to lock him away in the most impenetrable prison in the multiverse, BackCells prison, but he managed to escape with help from Sterling and some other people who'd been locked up in there as well and who were all now members of the Sharp Gang themselves. That then led to the two youngest members of the group, Jake Tagen and Ana Fenze. Both were now 13 years old and were originally from dimension D667, but had both been sent into BackCells prison in dimension S316 by the overseer of their world, also sometimes referred to as the Demon Queen, Fear herself. Although the kids didn't know this at the time, Fear herself had sent them into BackCells because both Jake and Ana had found crystals called the Gems of the Angelic that had sunk into their bodies and gave them different superhuman abilities. Jake had gotten the ability to create a glowing green plasma from his hands that he could use to heal wounds on himself and others, as well as giving him the ability of flight. Ana had gotten the ability to phase through people and objects, though while in BackCells, she'd only developed enough to phase herself through biological materials. Now she could even help other people phase through objects, and is still actively trying to develop how far she can take her powers. She is also still recovering from a previous dramatic inability to make any decisions, though she has never had a problem making quick calls while in combat. Much was still unknown about the crystals Jake and Ana possessed, but Coșmara, also from their world, D667, claimed she had some people she could ask about them, to possibly get more information. Because the overseer of their world, Fear herself, had a hatred for any people with superpowers being in her universe, which had been the thing that prompted her to send them to BackCells prison, Jake and Ana are currently living in the Sharp Tank, and Sterling is actively trying to find a school for them to attend. Though he is seeking options in other universes, hoping to find a place suited to helping the kids develop mentally, be around kids their own age, and hopefully to train them further in using their abilities. At the same time Astra had been negotiating to lock Gooby the Gopher away in BackCells prison, Sterling found himself trapped in there as well. He then ended up meeting up with Jake, Ana, Gooby the Gopher, Unkillable Kate, and a recovering lobotomized supervillain named Skinner. Together they had all managed to escape the prison after a battle with that universe's overseer, Dresden, Oakland. And Sterling still suspects that for some reason Dresden allowed them to escape, as their departure from that universe had been a bit too easy. The recovering supervillain mentioned, Skinner, was currently in a psychiatric hospital in Dimension A016, and Jake would visit him regularly to try and further heal his mind, though Jake had found that his powers could largely only heal physical injuries, not psychological ones, though he could at least somewhat temporarily soothe mental discomfort. For this meeting, they had brought Skinner out to their base for the day in case the information was able to sink into his mind, though it wasn't clear if he was absorbing the words, and he certainly was not in a position to do his own introduction. After speaking about him, it was time for Kate Blacour, or the Unkillable Kate, to have her introduction. She had been trapped in BackCells prison for much longer than Jake and Ana. She'd been stuck in there for 20 years, 13 of which she'd spent as a prisoner in a fighting arena under the command of a man named Gentleman Bestar, who Kate had killed in her final day of lockup. Kate had no powers herself, but was such a skilled fighter and was so used to physical pain that she had never been beaten in a fight in BackCells, though she had sustained many, many injuries in her time there. Kate was now doing all she could to overcome the incredibly defensive and aggressive personality that she'd had to develop to survive in BackCells prison, and Sterling was incredibly helpful in aiding her with that. She did have a bit of a tendency to clash with other members of the group, because Kate had no qualms about killing anyone they fought, while Alexis tended to have a hard and fast rule that the group not kill anyone that may possess a soul. While she'd only discovered this recently, Kate was from Dimension D667, like Jake, Ana, and Mara, and Kate had been locked away in BackCells prison at 5 years old as part of an agreement between Dresden, Oakland, the overseer of BackCells, and Fear herself, the overseer of D667. Though Kate acknowledged that this would be easier to explain after Mara did her introduction, and they could get into more information about Fear herself, Dresden, and BackCells prison. Coșmara Noroi was the last person in the group to introduce herself. She often just went by Mara, and, as mentioned, was from Dimension D667 like Jake, Ana, and Kate. Mara had worked with a group called the Predator Coalition of Demon Hunters, trying to kill the demons that lurked in the shadows of her world and tormented people, though it wasn't known by most in her world that these demons existed at all. Mara had eventually been given a curse by the overseer of her world and the creator of most of the demons in her world, Fear herself. This curse gave Mara incredible demonic powers, making her as strong as Heath at his peak, but without the drawback of needing to rest from using her powers too much. She also had demon markings on her skin, and every time she killed a demon, or anything else, the markings would spread across her body more and more. This caused a lot of tension between her and members of the Predator Coalition, most specifically with her and her once boyfriend, Clayton. He claimed that it was likely if she ever became fully overtaken by the curse, she'd become an unstoppable evil demon, and he threatened that if she ever killed any more demons and let the curse spread more, he'd have to put her down. Clayton was a high-ranking member of the Coalition, so many people backed him up out of fear. Until Benny found himself in Mara's universe and helped her see how cruel the people around her were being and encouraged her to have more confidence that she could handle whatever came from this curse. She still does some work with the Coalition to bring down demons in her world, but is now more so a regular member of the Sharp Gang. On a recent mission with Kate, Mara completed her curse transformation and did not, in fact, become an uncontrollable monster. Far from it, in fact. Mara is now able to activate and deactivate her powers and full demon form as she sees fit. She also learned why Fear gave her these powers in the first place. Fear herself, who has claimed that Dresden Oakland, the overseer of BackCells prison, is her love, gave Mara the curse so that Mara could develop her powers enough to eventually kill a being called the Reaper. Fear had apparently planned to give Mara this curse since her birth, but Dresden, being aware of this plan, had wanted to train someone himself to take on the curse. Fear allowed him to take Kate from her world to put in BackCells prison, where Dresden watched over her, without her knowing, and allowed her to go through a treacherous upbringing of survival in an attempt to make her strong enough to take on the strain of the curse. He'd eventually put a shard of the Multiversal Orb, which he'd acquired from Astra during their brief friendship, into the prison for Kate to find and use to escape. But she didn't do this in the intended time frame, so Fear went ahead with giving the curse to Mara as originally intended. The Sharp Gang is still not sure yet why Fear wants the Reaper dead, but the Reaper is a being whose sole job is to go to universes where there are too many dangerous and overly powerful beings that threaten to leave their world and destroy other parts of the multiverse. Once there, she can kill every single life form in a universe by slicing her scepter through the Overseer energy of the Overseer from that dimension. Herald then chimed in to say that even if Mara did kill the Reaper, another being would just inherit the role, though the current Reaper had existed so long that Herald had no idea how that next being would be chosen. There is still some uncertainty with what Fear's intentions are, but she had told Mara that if she didn't kill the Reaper, it would mean the death of everyone from Mara's universe, including Jake, Ana, and Kate. Herald also claimed it was alarming to hear that Fear herself was working with Dresden. Dresden had Overseer's bonds made with nearly 16,000 Overseers across the multiverse. Overseer's bonds are an agreement between two Overseers, often made when one does a significant favor for another in exchange for an equivalent favor in return later on. They are binding deals, and if broken, the Overseer who breaks it is instantly brandished with a massive painful scar somewhere on their body, generally on their face or head, that they can then never get rid of, to show immediate evidence to anyone that sees them that they are a traitor who goes back on their word. If an Overseer makes this bond with someone and does not have the other end of the favor called in before they pass on their Overseer role, the Overseer they pass it to next is still indebted to whoever the deal was made with. Dresden had made so many deals as a result of being the Overseer of BackCells prison. He had developed the prison so that any Overseer could make a deal with Dresden to lock away particularly dangerous beings from their world in exchange for an Overseer's bond with him. Astra was able to provide more information still as to the fact that her own mother, Tarsa, had been the Overseer of Dresden's universe 6,000 years ago and had tormented his world with monsters and incredibly dangerous entities. Tarsa then created the very foundation that Dresden would work for, attempting to secure and contain these dangerous entities and protect the world from them. She did this simply to have an entertaining show for herself, making new monsters using the Multiversal Orb and seeing how Dresden and his co-workers would handle them. She would also eventually be the reason Dresden appears the way he does currently. She eventually caused the downfall of the Foundation Dresden worked for, and let monsters run rampant and completely overtake his world, just before she gave him that universe's Overseer abilities and abandoned that dimension, while it was on the brink of incurring the wrath of the Reaper. The Reaper had taken pity on Dresden and let him live, but still killed all other life in his universe, which eventually led to him turning his universe into the prison world that it is now. Astra and Dresden had once briefly bonded over their shared hatred of Astra's mother, though when Dresden had learned more about what Astra had done to her world as an Overseer, he'd quickly come to hate her as well. Astra claimed that while he tried to conceal it, Dresden had a passionate hatred for all Overseers. Astra even claimed that Bio-Mechs, like Charlie, were originally an abandoned creation of Dresden's that he'd likely intended to use to kill other Overseers, but when they didn't work completely as he intended, he tossed them into another universe and pretended to have no relation to them. So far as Astra knew, Dresden had only ever told her about the fact that he'd made Bio-Mechs, and he generally tried to keep it a secret, but Astra had mentioned it to a few other Overseers in her time. Herald was further alarmed to hear this, as he claimed that Dresden had a reputation for being a completely honorable Overseer who rarely called in his favors. But if he was conspiring with someone who sought to kill the Reaper, then there may be more to him than Dresden let on. Luckily, Herald's own master, Elloise Ludum, was one of the few Overseers who had repaid her end of a bond with Dresden already, so she wasn't at risk of him asking her for something dangerous. Dresden and Elloise had met thousands of years ago, and Dresden had agreed to contain a dangerous entity threatening Elloise in exchange for her teaching him what he needed to know in order to build BackCells prison in the first place. Mentioning that led to the final threat the group had faced many times: Elloise Ludum. She was the Overseer of Dimension Z009 and had turned her entire universe into a set of combat arenas for the entertainment of herself and other Overseers. She'd have different themed competitions where Overseers from across the multiverse would bring powerful beings or creatures from their worlds to compete, against their will, in deadly games, only allowed to leave if they won. The group had gone up against her multiple times now, but Astra had managed to put a curse of her own on Ludum, so that the group could now track her movements across the multiverse and get in and out of her dimension as they desired, despite Z009 generally only being accessible by invitation from Ludum or one of her lackeys. Herald, as someone who worked for Ms. Ludum, did various jobs for her, but mostly scoured the multiverse for specific champions to bring into her arena for whatever event they were running next. Herald didn't give much information about himself, simply stating that his father had been a warlord who sold him to Elloise Ludum when he was young, but said he loved working for her, and he was sure she'd come to rescue him any day now. Herald had been originally captured in a bizarre team-up between Gooby the Gopher and Vasilia's squirrel friend Zasheetnik a few months ago, and since then he had just kind of been chilling with the group. Once Herald was finished talking, the whole group tried to come up with anything else to discuss, but most of them had their minds reeling with ideas of what they should do next and what took priority. While they all muttered about options, Sterling was formulating a plan of his own, though not sharing his intentions, as he knew others would consider it too dangerous. Plus, it wasn't something he needed any help with. It was really quite simple. They needed to know more about what Dresden intended, so Sterling thought he'd simply go to BackCells prison again and ask him.
Well, I hope that was a useful summary of the important information from Multiverse Tales and has people caught up or clarified some things. But of course, this was just a small fraction of all the stuff in the actual series. If you want the more fleshed out stories, you can go to the actual Multiverse Tales playlist. Or if you want more from some of the specific characters, as I've said, some of them are narrators of series on this channel. Vasilia Kuznet narrates the Fantasy Armor episodes, Champagne McGreggor narrates the Dinosaur episodes, and sometimes I'll do banter episodes where I have multiple narrators or characters from this series explaining the lore or story for an episode. I've got a full playlist of those banter episodes as well. They're generally more on the comedic side. And of course, a huge thank you to everyone who submitted this month. There were a lot of really cool designs. I was a little bit pickier than usual because they were all recurring Multiverse Tales characters. So a specific thank you to the people who were selected. Sam Lauder, TDR64, Mikhail Ivchenka, and Devonte Edwards. And as I do at the end of every community redraw, I have to announce the theme for the next month's community redraw, which this time is going to be SCPs. I want you all to submit your own original SCP, and I'm going to be taking some of the submissions and turning them into dragons for a Multiverse Tales episode with the working title, The Beast Summoner, to slay a cursed predator. Though I do have one other Multiverse Tales story that I have to tell before that, so we're probably getting 2 Multiverse Tales episodes this month. Lore for the SCP is also appreciated, and I would like you to submit a drawing of a potato holding a weapon of your choice so that I know you followed the instructions. Very excited to see what you all submit, but besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note, and the thought I want to leave people with is a quote from a man named Michael Beckwith, who said that your pain pushes you until your vision pulls you. It's very easy to just trudge along in life being nudged forward trying to avoid pain that's too intolerable. But once you have an idea of where you want to go and what you want to achieve, you're then pulled forward by that, and the climb towards it becomes so much more meaningful than how you were just ambling along before. I hope that's inspiring, I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Monday. Goodbye.